This analysis is based on publicly available reporting and official policy documents. This is not about anyone feeling pressure. This is about a country narrowing the room around one-way pressure tactics. Because in trade and in statecraft, pressure is not an emotion. Pressure is leverage. It is exposure on one side and alternatives on the other. And what has changed over the past year is not the tone of the headlines. What has changed is the structure underneath them. So the question that matters is simple. Has the room actually been closed? Not rhetorically, structurally. To answer that, we need to start with the baseline, because leverage only makes sense when you understand vulnerability. And for decades, vulnerability has been Canada's quiet problem. Official data provides a stark starting point. In 2024, 65.9% of Canadian exporting enterprises relied on the United States as their only export market. Not their largest market, their only market. That single number explains why pressure tactics have historically worked. If access is threatened and there is no immediate alternative, the cost of resistance rises quickly. That is the condition pressure relies on. High exposure, low optionality. That is the baseline Canada has lived with. It shaped policy choices. It shaped negotiating behavior. It shaped how risk was priced. And that is the baseline Ottawa has been trying to change. The first place this shift becomes visible is in tariff policy. Not in speeches, not in messaging, in dates and categories. Effective September 1st, 2025, Canada removed 25% counter tariffs on many American goods, but it did not remove all of them. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles remain in place. That distinction matters because this is not escalation for its own sake, and it is not capitulation either. It is selectivity. Broad pressure was eased. Strategic leverage points were preserved. That is what a system does when it is managing risk rather than reacting to headlines. A purely reactive posture oscillates. It drops tools under stress, or it deploys them without discrimination. This approach does neither. It preserves optionality. It signals discipline. It keeps channels open without surrendering leverage. That alone does not close the room, but it signals intent. And intent matters when it is backed by structure. That intent becomes explicit when you examine doctrine. In January 2026, a clear framework was articulated on the global stage. The argument was not dramatic. It was procedural. Uncertainty, it argued, is no longer an anomaly. It is now embedded in the system. And when uncertainty becomes structural, dependence becomes risk. The proposed response was not retreat. It was diversification, not as a moral stance, as a hedge. Allies will diversify to hedge against uncertainty. That framing matters because hedging is not about cutting ties. It is about reducing downside. Sovereignty, in this view, is no longer just legal or symbolic. It is anchored in a country's ability to withstand pressure without losing coherence. That reframing shifts the debate. It moves the focus away from intent and toward capacity, not who wants what, who can endure what. That doctrine also rejects a familiar trap, negotiating bilaterally from a position of weakness. When retaliation is the primary tool being used, the way to blunt its impact is not defiance. It is redundancy, options, alignment. That is not ideology. It is systems thinking. And doctrine only matters if it translates into implementation. So the next question follows naturally. Where are the alternatives? Where is the redundancy? Where is the evidence that the room is being narrowed? The most concrete answer begins with trade architecture. Canada is not improvising from scratch. Official listings show 15 free trade agreements covering 51 countries and roughly 1.5 billion consumers. That does not eliminate dependence overnight. It does not magically reroute supply chains, but it does establish pathways, legal certainty, market access, and in a pressure scenario, credible pathways matter. Pressure is most effective when the target has nowhere else to go. Alternatives do not need to be equal. They need to be real. They need to be usable. That is where diversification stops being aspirational and becomes operational. It becomes an engineering problem. How many routes exist? How fast can they scale? How much friction exists in the transition? These questions determine resilience more than rhetoric ever could. Nowhere is this logic clearer than in the auto sector, because autos are where exposure is not theoretical. It is measurable. Industry data shows vehicles were the second largest export by value in 2024, totaling $46.5 billion. 92% of those exports went to the United States. That concentration explains why autos have long been seen as a pressure lever. When dependence is that asymmetric, leverage appears straightforward. So if structural change is real, it must show up here. And it does. Not through confrontation, through predictability, through timelines, through policy design. The government has committed to a clear market trajectory. 100% of new light-duty vehicle sales are targeted to be zero emission by 2035, with interim milestones. 20% by 2026, 60% by 2030. These are not abstract aspirations. They function as signals. They tell manufacturers where demand is being guided. They reduce uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty lowers risk. Predictability is what long-term capital responds to. Factories are not built on sentiment. They are built on forecasts, rules, and credible timelines. That predictability is reinforced through policy instruments. In early 2026, a new auto strategy package was announced. It includes an incentives program totaling $2.3 billion, with purchase incentives up to $5,000 for battery electric and fuel cell vehicles, and up to $2,500 for plug-in hybrids, with defined eligibility conditions. Again, agreement is not required. Understanding is. This is policy architecture designed to anchor investment, to signal that commitments will persist beyond a single cycle. Durability is the point. Durability matters because fixed capital does not move easily. Factories do not relocate on impulse. Supply chains are not redeployed without cost. Once built, they create inertia, not permanence, but friction. And friction changes leverage. When investment decisions favor stability over volatility, pressure loses efficiency. Not immediately, gradually. That is how structural power accumulates. This is also where political signaling becomes relevant. Pressure tactics thrive on fragmentation. They rely on internal disagreement. They depend on voices arguing that resistance is unsustainable. When prominent figures across the political spectrum emphasize unity and independence in the face of external pressure, that fragmentation becomes harder to exploit. This does not imply unanimity. It does not imply consensus. It implies that the political cost of one-way concessions rises, because coercion becomes less likely to produce rapid internal collapse. Again, this is not symbolism. It is cost calculus. So step back and assemble the full picture. The vulnerability baseline was real. A majority of exporters were once dependent on a single market. Selective tariffs remain in place at strategic nodes. A doctrine has been articulated that treats diversification as risk management. Trade agreements provide alternatives that can be activated over time. Industrial policy is shaping long-term investment expectations. Political signaling suggests reduced tolerance for asymmetric pressure. None of these elements is decisive on its own. Together, they alter the terrain. They narrow the room. And that distinction matters. Pressure does not vanish. It becomes more expensive. It requires more effort. It delivers fewer guaranteed outcomes. That is what a shift in leverage looks like. The real test is durability. Structures only matter if they hold under stress. When prices rise, when jobs are threatened, when patience erodes. This is not a victory lap. It is a posture shift from reactive to structural, from short-term relief to long-term capacity. And in geopolitics, capacity is what endures. From here on, one-way pressure tactics face higher costs because the room is no longer wide open. That is the shift. That is the signal. And that is what actually matters.